Peter, what do you read?
Richard III by Shakespeare.
Oh, dude, I got a test on that next watch. Can you give me like a 10-minute video reviewing like the Shakespeare and maybe a professional scene or something like that?
Yeah,
you do that?
Yeah.
Here you go. Thanks.
William Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, United Kingdom. He was baptized on April 26th of that year, and although his birth date is not confirmed, it is believed to be on April 23rd, 1564. He was the son of John Shakespeare, a leather worker that specialized in the making of gloves with soft leather, and also an affluent businessman. His father also eventually became the town bailiff. His mother was Mary Arden, a daughter of a land-owning farmer. William had 2 sisters and 3 younger brothers. There were 2 important locations throughout Shakespeare's life: Stratford and London. Shakespeare was born, grew up, and bought his house in Stratford. London was important to him because it was the epicenter of English theater, and that was where he worked. Shakespeare played many roles in the English theater, including playwriting, acting, and eventually becoming a business partner in the Lord Chamberlain's men. William most likely attended Stratford's grammar school. His learning had an emphasis on Latin, with memorization and acting Latin plays. Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in 1582, and they eventually had 3 children, Susanna and twins Judith and Hamnet. Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died when he was 11. Shakespeare died on April 23, 1616. He wrote a total of 37 plays and 154 sonnets in the 52 years he was alive. It is believed that Richard III was finished in 1593 and was William Shakespeare's 6th play. Shakespeare wrote Richard III while Queen Elizabeth I, descendant of the king that overthrew Richard III, was in power. Because of this, Shakespeare was likely required to portray Richard III as more deformed and evil than he actually was. I will be acting out Act 3, Scene 5 from Richard III, an important scene in which Richard and Buckingham conspire to make Richard king. There are a few important characters to know for this play. Richard is the main character and villain from this story. Edward is Richard's older brother and the King of England. George of Clarence is also the brother of Richard. Lady Anne is King Henry's daughter-in-law and widow to Edward, Prince of Wales. Elizabeth of York is the niece of Richard III. Buckingham is the right-hand man to Richard III throughout the play, until he becomes too afraid of Richard's lust for power. Henry Tudor is the Earl of Richmond and hero of the play. As the play opens, Richard is the Duke of Gloucester, while his brother Edward is king. Richard reveals that he was born with a deformed body, and it is these deformities that cause him to be the villain of the story. Richard aspires to become the King of England, and he will do whatever it takes to be the king. George of Clarence is the brother of Richard and Edward. In his first steps to become the king, Richard frames his brother George of treason and influences his brother Edward to imprison his brother George, and eventually George is killed. After strong convincing, Richard then marries Lady Anne despite the fact that Richard had killed her husband and father-in-law. Richard reveals to the audience how amused he is that he was able to manipulate Lady Anne into marrying him despite so recently mourning the loss of her husband and father-in-law. When the sick King Edward dies, his sons are next in line for the throne, but Richard imprisons them. The following is Act 3, Scene 5 from Richard III. It involves Buckingham swearing his allegiance to Richard and the 2 convincing the Lord Mayor that a loyal nobleman they killed was a traitor.
Cast thou quake and change thy color. Murder thy breath in the middle of a word. And as they begin, stop again, as if they were distraught and mad with terror.
Tut, I can counterfeit that deep tragedian. Speak and look back, and pry on every side. Tremble and start a wagging of a straw, intending deep suspicion. Ghastly looks are at my service, like enforced smiles, and both are ready in their office, at any time to grace my stratagems. But what? Is Catesby gone?
He is, and see, he brings the mayor along.
Lord Mayor!
Look, a drawbridge there.
Hark! A drum!
Catesby, over the walls.
Lord Mayor, the reason we have sent...
Look back, defend here. Here are the enemies.
God, in our innocency, defend and guard us.
Be patient, friends. Radcliffe and Lovell.
Here's the head of the ignoble traitor, the dangerous and unexpected Hastings.
So dear I love the man that I must weep. I took him for the plainest, hardest man I know. That breathed upon the earth was a Christian. Made him my book when my soul recorded the history of all her secret thoughts. So soon her Dwab voice with shone of virtue, that his apparent own guilt omitted. I mean, this conversation with Shore's wife, he loved and lived with the attendant of suspect.
Well, well, he was the covertest sheltered traitor that ever lived. Would you not imagine, or almost believe, were it not that by great preservation we lived to tell it to you, the subtle traitor, this day had plotted in the council house to murder me and my good Lord of Gloucester?
What had he so?
What, think you, we are Turks or infidels? Or what we would, against the form of the law, proceed thus rashly to the villain's death? But that extreme peril of the case, the peace of England, was our personal safety, and forced us to this execution.
Now befall you, he deserved his death, and you, my good lord, both have well proceeded to warn false traitors from the like attempts. I've never looked better at his hands, after he once fell with Mistress Shore.
Yet we have not determined he should die, until you looked up at the lordship and see of his death, which now in the loving hands of these our friends, somehow against our meeting have prevented. Because, my lord, we should have done what you heard, the traitor speak, and timorously confess the manner and propose of his treason. That might you have significant decide, unto the citizens who haply may misconstrue you in him and wail his death.
But my good lord, your grace's word shall serve, as well as I have seen and heard him speak. And doubt you not, right noble princes both, but all acquaint our duteous citizens with all you just proceedings in this cause.
And in the end, we wish that our lordship were here to avoid the carpeting census of the world.
But since you come too late of our intents, yet witness what you hear we did intend. And so, my good Lord Mayor, we bid you farewell.
Go after, cousin Buckingham, the mayor towards Guildhall, him and all his post. There you'll meet your advantage of time. Infer the bastardy of Edward's children. Tell them how Edward put a death to a citizen, only saying he would make his son heir to the crown, meaning indeed his house, which by the sign thereof was temned so. Moreover, urge his hateful luxury and bestial appetite in lust, in change of his lust, which stretched to their servants, daughters, and wives, without control, listed to make his prey. Nay, for a need thus come far my person, tell them, when my mother went to with a child of the upstature of Edward noble York, my princely father then had wars in France, and by just computation of the time, found that the issue was not his bootleg, which well appeared in his lineaments, being nothing like the noble duke of my father, but touch this sparely twerve off afar, because you know, my lord, my mother lives.
Fear not, my lord, I'll play the orator, as if the golden fee for which I plead were for myself, and so my lord and you.
If you were to thrive well, bring them to Baynard's castle, where you shall find me and accompanied with reverend fathers and well-learned bishops.
I go, and towards 3 or 4 o'clock, look for the news that the Guildhall offers.
Now I will take some privy order to draw the brats of Clarence out of sight, and to give notice that no matter of person at any time will remorse unto the princess.
Richard then takes the throne, and after his coronation, he has the late King Edward's sons executed, as well as Lady Anne once she is no longer useful to him. After killing Lady Anne, Richard begins courting his niece, Elizabeth of York. Taking note of the corruption occurring during Richard's seize of power, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, assembles an army and challenges Richard's kingship. Richard has had several knights that follow his orders throughout the play. but he has alienated some of them through his ruthless tactics, and many join the Earl of Richmond's army. The night before Richard and Henry Tudor's armies battle, the ghosts of the people Richard has murdered visit each of them. When Richard sees the ghosts, they curse at him and tell him that he will be killed in the battle the next day for his sins. They also talk to Richmond and tell him that they are on his side and that he will rule England and have a line of kings. Before the battle, both leaders give speeches to their men. Richard's speech focuses on the rebels being evil and that he is the righteous king of England. Richmond's speech tells the men that God is on their side and focuses on the good to come if they win the battle. Just before the battle, one of Richard's commanders mutinies and refuses to take his army into battle with Richard. The two armies fight at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richmond proves successful against Richard and slays him at the battle. After the battle, Richmond is coronated as King Henry VII and marries Elizabeth of York. The scene acted was important to the overall play because the Lord Mayor decided to accept Richard's dubious story and allow Richard and Buckingham to kill anyone in the way of attaining the kingship. This is an important theme of the story, which is willful ignorance of Richard's evil that often leads to death and destruction. This can be seen when Lady Anne knows of Richard's terrible intentions but marries him anyway. Another theme is the influence of linguistic persuasion and its ability to provide power to those who use it correctly, such as Richard. As stated by author Catherine Blaney, Shakespeare created a fantasizing character and an entertaining villain in Richard throughout Richard III. It is Shakespeare's command of the English language and his keen sense of drama and psychological depth that makes his plays so affecting and memorable. Much like other Shakespeare plays, Richard often speaks directly to the audience to reveal his schemes and feelings. This is one of Shakespeare's historical plays, and like Macbeth or King John, it has many historical inaccuracies. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this Shakespeare play because it had a clear and simple plot. Richard uses his evil schemes to become king before being overthrown by the righteous Richmond. There are many intricate details and stories throughout the play that prove entertaining while reading it and watching it performed. Because of that, this is my favorite Shakespeare play that I have read.